the night her father sold her, Verity Lowell learned that a woman with no fortune of her own is not a person in the eyes of the world, but a coin, and that a desperate man will spend even his own daughter, if the debt is large enough and the creditor cruel enough, and call it, to the last, a kindness. She was 20 years old, the only child of a country gentleman who had gambled and drunk and speculated away every acre and every guinea the Lowells had ever possessed, until nothing remained of the family's old respectability but a mortgaged house, a mountain of debt, and a daughter of uncommon beauty and no dowry whatsoever. Verity had watched the ruin come for years, helpless, as her father sank deeper into the power of the men who lent to failing gentlemen at ruinous rates. And she had known, in the way one knows a storm is coming from the color of the sky, that some reckoning waited for her at the end of it. But she had not imagined it would come as it did, in the library, at midnight, with her father gray-faced and shaking, and unable to meet her eyes, telling her that she was to be married within the week, and to whom? To the Duke of Ravenscar, he said, and the very name seemed to drop the temperature of the room. Verity's blood went to ice. Everyone in the county knew the Duke of Ravenscar, though almost no one had seen him in years, and what they knew was all terror. He was a recluse, shut away in his great black pile of a house above the sea, a man of 35, who never came to church nor to the assemblies, whose face, those few who had glimpsed it swore, was hideously scarred, and whose reputation was worse than his face. They said his young wife had died at Ravenscar years ago under circumstances no one would speak of plainly. They said his own brother had died there too. They said the Duke was cruel and half-mad and dangerous, and that the servants who could be got to work at Ravenscar at all were paid triple and left within the year with white faces and closed mouths. Mothers frightened their children with his name. And to this man, this scarred, silent, dreaded monster, her father had promised her. "He has bought the whole of it," her father whispered, and there was a horrible relief under his shame, the relief of a drowning man who has found something to cling to, no matter whose child it is. "Every note, every mortgage, every debt I owe, he has purchased them all from Cain, and he will forgive them entire and settle the house on me for my life, if I give him you. Verity, I had no choice. You do not understand what Cain is. If the Duke had not come forward, it would have been Cain who took you. And Cain is 1,000 times the worse. You cannot know. At least the Duke is a gentleman. At least there is a name, a title, a settlement. I have saved you from the worse of two fates. That is all a ruined man can do for his daughter. God forgive me. It is done. The contracts are signed." Verity looked at her father for a long moment. This weak, weeping, broken man who had loved her, in his way, and had ruined her in his way, and who could not now tell the difference between the two. And she felt something in her own heart go very cold and very still, the way a deep pool goes still when the storm has passed, and only the depth remains. She did not rage at him. There would have been no purpose in it, and besides, she saw that the raging was all being done inside him already, that he would carry the shame of this night to his grave, whatever comfort he tried to make of it. She thought instead, with a clarity that surprised her, of all the small, helpless years that had led to this, the creditors at the door, the sold horses, the turned gowns, the way she had learned to make one candle last and one loaf stretch, the slow education of a gentlewoman in exactly how little the world owes a girl with no money of her own. She had known somewhere that it would end in her being spent. She had simply hoped for a little longer. "You keep saying you had no choice," she said at last, quietly, and her voice did not shake. which frightened her father more than tears would have. "But I think, Papa, that a man always has a choice, right up until the moment he signs it away. And then he tells himself he never had one, so that he need not feel the weight of what he chose. I do not hate you, but do not ask me to call it a kindness. Call it what it is, and let us both live with it." And she took up her candle and went up to her cold room and sat at the window until the sky grayed, dry-eyed, and made herself as ready as a person can be to be handed to a monster. And Verity stood in the cold library and understood that she had been sold, that her marriage was a transaction between two men over a stack of paper, that her consent had never once been asked, because a portionless daughter's consent is not a thing the world requires, and that within a week she would be carried off to the black house above the sea to belong, body and name and future, to the monster the whole county feared. She did not weep. She had passed weeping some hours before. She only asked, in a small, steady voice, one question: "What manner of man buys a wife he has never met?" And her father had no answer, and looked away, and the candle guttered, and the thing was done. She did not know that night that the question was the right one, and that its answer, when at last she heard it, whispered in the dark, and never meant for her ears, would overturn everything she believed about the man she feared, and about her own heart, and about the difference between a monster and a man the world has simply agreed to call one. They were married 6 days later, and Verity did not see her husband's face until she stood beside him at the altar, and when she saw it at last, she understood at once why the county called him a monster, and began, though she did not yet know it, to be wrong about everything. Ravenscar Hall was every dreadful thing rumor had promised. A vast black-stoned house set high above the gray sea, all towers and shuttered windows and long cold galleries wrapped in a silence so deep it pressed on the ears. Verity was brought there in a closed carriage on her wedding morning, alone, her few possessions in a single trunk, and married in the small, chill chapel of the house with no guests but the necessary witnesses and the grim old chaplain. For who would come to celebrate such a match? And when the moment came for her to lift her eyes to the man she was binding herself to forever, she found him already looking down at her, and Verity, who had braced herself with all her strength, could not help the small, sharp breath that escaped her. The Duke of Ravenscar was a tall, powerfully made man, dark-haired, and down the left side of his face, from brow to jaw, ran a long, terrible scar. An old burn, she would later understand, the skin drawn and silvered and cruel, pulling at the corner of his eye and the edge of his mouth, so that even in repose his face seemed to hold a permanent grimness, a look of contained ferocity. It was a face that had plainly frightened a great many people, and had learned, long ago, to expect to. And his eyes, when they met hers, dark eyes, deep-set beneath a hard brow, held something she had not expected at all, something that flickered across them so fast she thought she had imagined it. Not cruelty, not the cold appraisal of a man inspecting a purchase, but a kind of braced, defensive dread, as though it were he who feared her, he who was waiting to be recoiled from, he who had learned to read the flinch in a woman's face before she could hide it. Verity did not flinch. She did not know why. Every nerve in her had prepared to, and something, some obscure stubbornness, some refusal to give the whole cruel world the satisfaction, held her still, and she looked steadily up into the scarred and dreadful face of the monster of Ravenscar, and did not look away. And she saw the surprise of it move through him, saw the dark eyes widen a fraction, as though a woman meeting his gaze without horror were a thing that had not happened to him in longer than he could remember. There was no wedding breakfast, no festivity, no crowd of well-wishers. There was only the cold chapel and the grim chaplain and the signing of the register, and then the great echoing silence of the house, closing around a marriage that no one had come to celebrate. Verity was led through the long galleries of Ravenscar to the rooms that were to be hers, and she walked beside her new husband's rigid silence, and looked about her at the black-panelled walls and the shuttered windows and the portraits of dead Ravenscars staring down through the gloom, and she waited to feel the despair she had every right to feel. But it did not come quite as she expected, for a house tells on its master, if one knows how to read it, and Ravenscar, for all its dread and its darkness, was not the house of a cruel man. It was clean and well-ordered and cared for. The fires were lit against her coming. The few servants, though they went softly and spoke low, did not have the beaten, flinching look of a household in terror of its lord, but rather the guarded watchfulness of people protecting something. And her husband, this scarred giant the whole county named a monster, walked her to her door and stopped at the threshold and did not cross it, bowed to her, stiffly, and said only that she should ring for anything she wanted, and that she was mistress here and might go where she pleased, and that he hoped she would try to be, he seemed to search for the word, and to find it a strange one in his own mouth, content. And then he was gone, down the dark gallery, and Verity stood alone in her wedding gown in the beautiful cold rooms, and pressed her hands to her face, and tried to make sense of a monster who bowed at her door and wished her, awkwardly, to be content. He spoke to her only once during the whole grim ceremony, low, under the chaplain's droning, when the ring was on her finger. "You need not be afraid of me," he said. That was all. It was not the practiced reassurance of a bridegroom. It came out rough and abrupt, as though the words cost him, as though he were more used to being feared than to trying to prevent it, and had half forgotten how. And then the chaplain pronounced them man and wife, and the Duke of Ravenscar offered Verity his arm to walk her from the chapel, stiffly, formally, and she took it, the arm of the monster, the arm of the stranger who owned her now, and felt, under the fine cloth, that his own arm was rigid with a tension she could not name, and thought, for the first time, that a thing did not add up at Ravenscar, and that she did not yet know what it was. The first days of her marriage were the strangest of Verity's life, for they were not at all the days she had steeled herself to survive. She had come to Ravenscar braced for cruelty, for a brutal husband, a prison, the worst that rumor had prepared her for. Instead, she found herself installed in a set of beautiful rooms, warm and richly furnished, with a fire always lit, and a kind old housekeeper named Mrs. Pole to wait on her, and every comfort a duchess could want laid quietly at her disposal. She was given the freedom of the house and its grounds. She was treated by the few silent servants with a careful deference, and her husband, the monster she had been sold to, scarcely came near her at all. He did not touch her. On their wedding night, which she had lain awake dreading with her heart in her throat, he had not come to her chamber. He had sent Mrs. Pole with a quiet message that her grace was not to be disturbed, and Verity had lain alone in the great bed in the firelight, rigid, waiting for a footstep that never came, and had understood near dawn, with a confusion that unsettled her more than fear would have, that she was not going to be troubled at all, nor the next night, nor the next. The Duke dined with her stiffly at the great table at the far end of it, and made grave, courteous conversation about the weather and her comfort, and whether she wanted for anything. and looked at her sometimes when he thought she did not see with that same braced and guarded expression. And then he withdrew to his own wing of the house, and she did not see him again till the following evening. He was, to her utter bewilderment, unfailingly gentle, unfailingly distant, and unfailingly careful never to be alone with her longer than courtesy required. Verity did not know what to make of it. A man who had bought a wife, paid a fortune in forgiven debt for a beautiful young woman entirely in his power, and then housed her like a queen and never laid a finger on her, nor spoke her an unkind word. It made no sense by any reckoning she possessed. She watched him, cautiously, as the days went on, and she began to see the same wrongness she had felt at the altar everywhere she looked. She saw that the terrifying Duke of Ravenscar was gentle with his old dog, and grave and fair with his frightened servants, and that once, from a window, she watched him ride out to a tenant's cottage where a child was sick and stay the better part of the day. She saw that his people, who had every reason by rumor to hate and dread him, watched him instead with a strange, fierce protectiveness, as though they knew a thing about their master the wide world did not. She tried once to draw the truth from Mrs. Pole, the old housekeeper, who had a kind face and had plainly taken to the young mistress. But at the first careful question about the Duke's history, the scar, the rumors, the wife who had died, the old woman's face had closed like a shutter, and she had said only, low and fierce, "There's a deal of wicked talk in this county, your grace, told by folk that never once set foot in this house, nor troubled to learn the truth of anything. His grace is the finest man that ever drew breath, and has been used crueler than any Christian ought, and that's all I'll say, for it's not my tale to tell, and he'd not thank me for the telling." And she had pressed her lips together and gone about her work, and Verity had understood two things from it: that there was indeed a truth, a great and painful one, locked in the heart of Ravenscar, and that the servants who knew it guarded it not out of fear of their master, but out of love for him, which is a very different thing, and told her more than any answer could have. She thought a great deal in those quiet days about how a whole county comes to agree upon a lie, how a scar, and a silence, and a man's refusal to defend himself, and a death or two that grief had made mysterious, could be woven by idle, frightened tongues into a monster, and how easy it was, how comfortable, to believe the worst of a man who never argued back, and how few people in all the world will trouble to look past a frightening face to ask whether there might be a wronged and lonely soul behind it. She had believed it herself, a fortnight since. She was ashamed now of how readily she had believed it, and she began to suspect, cautiously, hardly daring, that the monster of Ravenscar was no monster at all, and that the truth of him was locked somewhere in that black, silent house behind the scarred face and the guarded eyes, and that no one had told it to her, and perhaps no one meant to. There was one evening that decided her more than any other. She had been unable to sleep, and had gone down in search of a book, and passing the door of the great library she had heard, of all sounds in that grim house, a child's voice, and looking in unseen, she had found her husband seated by the fire with a small girl of perhaps 6 upon his knee. His brother's orphaned daughter, she would learn, the last of the line, whom the Duke was raising as his own, and whom the servants kept carefully out of the sight of visitors, lest the county's cruel tongues find some new poison in it. The great scarred monster of Ravenscar was reading to the child, doing the voices, his deep, rough voice going high and foolish for the wolf and low and grand for the king. And the little girl was shrieking with laughter and burrowing against the very scar that grown men blanched at, patting it with one small hand as though it were the most ordinary thing in the world. And the Duke was laughing too, really laughing, his whole ruined face transformed by it into something Verity would not have believed it could hold. She drew back into the dark before they saw her, and stood in the cold passage with her hand pressed to her mouth, and knew, past any more doubting, that whatever the county said, whatever the rumors, whatever had happened in this house's dark history, the man she had been sold to was no monster. A monster does not do the voices. A monster is not patted upon his scar by a laughing child who has never learned to be afraid of him. And Verity resolved then that she would have the truth of Ravenscar if she had to prize it out of the very stones. It was the loneliness in the end, more than the fear, that drove her to the things she did. For a woman may bear being frightened of her husband, but there is a particular desolation in being kept, warm and comfortable and utterly alone, behind a wall of careful courtesy by a man who will not let her near enough, even to know him. A fortnight into her strange marriage, Verity had grown so weary of the wall that she resolved to breach it. She was the Duke's wife. She had bound her whole life to his, and she found she could no longer endure to live beside a locked door and a scarred silence, and never know what manner of man she had truly been given to, nor why he kept her at arm's length, as though she were the dangerous one. If he was a monster, she would know it plainly and arm herself. If he was something else, and every day at Ravenscar whispered to her that he was, then she would know that too, and God alone knew what she would do with it. She thought in those days a great deal about her own strange calm, for she had expected, when she let herself imagine this marriage, to be either broken by terror or numb with despair, and she was neither. Instead, she found in herself a steadiness she had not known she possessed, a refusal to be a passive thing that only waited to see what would be done to it. Perhaps it was the years of ruin that had done it, the long apprenticeship in surviving. Perhaps it was some flint in her own nature that had only wanted a hard enough stone to strike against. But she found she could not simply sit in her beautiful cold rooms and be a wife who was housed and fed and never known, forever, like a bird in a gilded room with the shutters closed. She was a person. She had been sold as a coin, but she had not stopped being a person the moment the contract was signed, whatever the world believed, and she would not consent to live as though she had. If knowledge was the only power left to a woman in her position, then she would gather knowledge. If listening at doors was the only door left open to her, then she would listen. And she was done being ashamed of using the only tools a powerless woman is ever given. So she began quietly to watch and to listen, as a woman with no power of her own has always had to do. She learned the habits of the house. She learned that the Duke kept late hours in his study in the West Tower, and that his one true confidant in all the world was not a servant, but an old friend, a plain retired army surgeon named Dr. Bramwell, who had served with the Duke's late brother and came often to Ravenscar, and was the only man who could be heard, sometimes, to make the grim Duke laugh. And she learned that on certain nights the two of them sat late over the fire in the study and talked low, and that the study door did not always latch, for the old wood had warped, and that a woman moving very quietly along the cold gallery outside could hear through the gap the voices within. She told herself she was not spying. She told herself a wife had a right to understand her own marriage. But the truth was simpler and less proud than that. She was lonely and afraid, and desperate to know whether the man who owned her was to be feared or, the thought frightened her more than the fear had, trusted, and she could see no other way to learn it, for he would tell her nothing to her face. So on a wild night, 3 weeks into her marriage, when the wind was off the sea, and the whole house groaned with it, and she saw the light of Dr. Bramwell's arrival and knew the two men would sit late. Verity Lowell, the Duchess of Ravenscar, sold to pay her father's debts, kept like a stranger in her own home, wrapped a shawl over her nightgown, and took up no candle for fear of the betraying light, and went barefoot and silent along the cold, dark gallery to the warped door of her husband's study, and stood in the dark outside it, and listened. What she heard, standing in the dark with her heart in her mouth, took the whole shape of her marriage and turned it inside out. For the two men within were speaking of her. She knew it the instant she heard her own name, and her husband's voice, when it came, was nothing like the stiff, grave courtesy he wore before her at dinner. It was low and raw and stripped bare, the voice of a man saying to his one friend the things he could say to no one else alive. "Cannot go on as it is, Bramwell. I know it," the Duke was saying. "She looks at me across that great table every evening, as though she is waiting to understand what I want of her. And the truth is I want nothing of her that she has not freely given, and I cannot tell her so, because to tell her would be to tell her everything, and then she would pity me, and I find I would rather be feared by her than pitied. God help me. I bought myself a wife, and I have not the courage to speak to her." "You did not buy yourself a wife," came the old surgeon's steady voice. "You bought that girl out of the hands of Josiah Cain, and you know it. And it is time you told yourself the truth of it, even if you will not tell her. When word reached you that Lowell had gambled his daughter into Cain's power, that Cain meant to take the girl himself in payment, a man who has buried 2 young wives already, and whom half the county suspects of putting them in the ground, you did not sit still. You bought up every note Lowell owed, at twice its worth, to get the girl out of that monster's reach before the ink was dry. And you married her yourself, because it was the only lawful way under heaven to put your name and your protection between her and Cain forever. You did not buy a wife, Ravenscar. You paid a fortune to save a stranger from a fate you could not stomach. And then, being who you are, you have housed her like a queen and kept your distance and let her go on believing you the monster, rather than burden her with the truth." "And what is the truth?" said the Duke bitterly. "That I am a scarred wreck of a man she was handed to like a parcel? That I saw her once, a year ago, in the market town? Did I ever tell you that? Bramwell. Saw her stop in the street to help an old beggar woman that everyone else stepped over, and thought her the loveliest and kindest thing I had ever seen, and knew in the same breath that a creature like that could never be for a man like me. And then to hear that Cain had got his claws into her father, I could not let it happen. But do not dress it up as nobility. I have married a girl who is terrified of me, who will spend her life shut in this tomb with a monster, and the kindest thing I can do for her now is to keep away and give her what freedom and comfort I can, and never, ever let her guess that the beast she was sold to has been half in love with her since before he ever owned her. That is the truth, and she must never hear it." "You will do no such thing," said Dr. Bramwell, and there was a rough affection in the old surgeon's voice. "You have kept your distance and kept your silence for 10 years, Ravenscar, and it has cost you your good name and near enough your reason, and I have stood by and watched it and said nothing because you would not hear me. I will not watch you do it again with this. That girl is not a fragile thing to be shut in a glass case. She has more courage in her than half the men I soldiered with. I have seen how she meets your eye when strong men look away. Tell her the truth. Tell her about Cain, and about the fire, and about your brother, and about your poor wife. God rest her. and let her decide for herself whether she can care for the man under the scar. You have decided it for her, and you have no right. You are so certain no woman could love you that you will not give one the chance to try. That is not humility, my friend. It is a kind of cowardice in a man who is a coward about nothing else on earth. There was a long silence within, and Verity, standing frozen in the dark, heard her husband draw a slow, unsteady breath, and when he spoke again, his voice had gone very low. And if I tell her, and I see it in her face, the pity, or worse, the fear, Bramwell, I have borne a great deal. I do not think I could bear that, not from her. It is easier to be the monster she was sold to than to be a man she cannot love. And Verity, standing in the cold dark gallery in her nightgown with tears streaming silently down her face, heard it, every word, and understood, all at once and forever, that she had been wrong about everything. The scar was not the mark of a monster. She would learn soon it was got dragging his own tenants from a burning barn. The dead wife, the dead brother, the dreadful rumors. She would learn the truth of those two in time, and find the world had slandered a grieving man who had borne it in silence rather than defend himself. The husband who would not touch her had beggared himself to save her from a real monster, and asked nothing, and meant to spend his life protecting her from the very distance of his own longing. She had been sold to the Duke the whole county feared, and the Duke the whole county feared was the gentlest, loneliest, most wronged man she had ever known. And he had loved her, quietly and hopelessly, before she had ever even known his name. She did not sleep that night, nor much of the next day, for a great turning over was going on inside her, and when it was done, she was not the same frightened girl who had been carried to Ravenscar in a closed carriage. She looked at her husband across the great table that evening with entirely new eyes, and it was as though a mask had been lifted from the whole house. Not his mask, but the one the world had fixed over him, and which she had worn before her own face without knowing it. Now, when the Duke made his stiff, grave, courteous conversation, and would not quite meet her gaze, she saw not a monster holding himself in check, but a lonely man holding himself away. Saw the care he took never to loom over her, never to raise his voice, never to let his scarred face catch her unawares. Saw that every cold distance she had taken for indifference or menace was in truth an act of the most painful self-denying tenderness, a man loving a woman by the only means he believed permitted him, from as far off as he could bear to stand. And something rose up in Verity, fierce and certain, against it. She was not going to be protected to death. She was not going to spend her life being kept warm and comfortable and alone on the far side of a wall built out of a good man's conviction that he was too monstrous to be loved. She had been given no choice in the selling of her. She had been a coin passed between men, but she found, now, that she had one choice left that was wholly her own, and she meant to make it. So that night, when the Duke rose from dinner and bowed and made to withdraw to his solitary wing as he did every night, Verity rose too, and crossed the long room to him before he could escape, and stood close, closer than she had ever stood, close enough that he went rigid and still close enough that she had to look up to meet the dark, braced eyes in the scarred face. And she said, quietly, steadily, "I heard you, Your Grace, 3 nights ago, outside your study. I heard everything you said to Dr. Bramwell about Cain, and why you bought my father's debts, and the barn, and the market town, and the rest of it, all of it. I know I had no right to listen, but I am not sorry, because it is the only true thing anyone has told me since I came here, and you would never have told it to my face." She watched the horror and the shame flood into his eyes, watched him begin to pull back, and she caught his hand, his large, scarred hand, in both of hers, and held it, and did not let him go. "You have decided, all by yourself, that I could never love a monster. But you are not a monster, Lucian. You are the best man I have ever known, and the loneliest, and I have had quite enough of being kept at arm's length by a husband who beggared himself to save me. I did not choose to come to Ravenscar, but I am choosing now to stay, not in your beautiful cold rooms, at the far end of your table, but here, with you, if you will have me, the whole of you, scar and silence and secret and all." For a long moment, the Duke of Ravenscar did not move, did not breathe, as though he feared that the smallest motion would shatter the impossible thing that was happening to him. She watched the war in his ravaged face, the 10 years of being feared and shunned and slandered, the hard certainty he had built, brick by brick, that he was a thing no one could love, all of it heaving against the plain, warm fact of her hand holding his and refusing to let go. She saw him try to summon the old armor, the withdrawal, the noble, self-denying distance, and she saw it fail him at last, undone by nothing more than a woman who would not step back. And then his great scarred hand turned within her own and closed around hers, gently, as though it held something infinitely precious and infinitely fragile, and the breath went out of him in a sound that was almost a sob, and he bowed his dark head until his brow rested against hers. "I do not know how to do this," he said, low and unsteady, a man of 35 confessing it like a boy. "I have been alone so long. I have forgotten how to be looked at. You will have to be patient with me, Verity. You will have to teach me how to be a man again, and not a monster in a shut-up house. I do not deserve it. But God help me, if you are truly offering it, I have not the strength to refuse you. I have wanted, for so long, only to be seen, and you have seen me, and stayed." And Verity, her own eyes streaming, lifted her free hand and laid it, deliberately, tenderly, against the scarred and silvered side of his face that the whole world had recoiled from, the first hand in 10 years to touch it, without horror, and felt him shudder at it, and hold still, and let her. They were not to have their happiness unchallenged, for the true monster of the tale had not finished with them yet. Josiah Cain was not a man who forgave being thwarted, and he had been thwarted of a great deal. He had meant to have Verity Lowell, had all but had her, the contracts nearly drawn, before the Duke of Ravenscar swept in and bought the whole debt out from under him and married the girl himself. And Cain had swallowed the loss with a smile and a bow, and gone away and bided his time, and looked for his revenge. He found it, as such men do, in the law and in the old poison of rumor. He came to Ravenscar a month after the wedding, all oily courtesy, with a lawyer at his side and a paper in his hand, and he stood in the great hall and laid out, with soft relish, the ruin he had prepared, that certain of Lowell's older debts, it transpired, had been pledged twice, and that a portion of what the Duke believed he had bought clear was in fact still, by a technicality of the law, in Cain's hands, and that Cain meant to press it, and to drag the Lowell name and the Ravenscar name together through the courts and the scandal sheets, and to see the whole county reminded at length and in print of every dark rumor that had ever attached to the scarred recluse who had snatched a girl from her rightful creditor. Unless, of course, Cain said, smiling. An arrangement might be reached. The girl was promised to me first, Your Grace. Debts of honor are such delicate things. And the Duke of Ravenscar, who had borne the slander of the whole county in silence for years rather than defend himself, went very still and very cold. And Verity saw him begin to gather himself to pay whatever ruinous price would keep her name and her father's out of the mire, to sacrifice himself again, silently, as was his whole nature. But Verity had done with letting the men in her life dispose of her over stacks of paper. She stepped forward into the middle of the great hall, and she spoke in the clear, steady voice of a duchess, and she astonished them all. For she had not been idle in her weeks at Ravenscar, nor stopped listening once she had learned what listening could do. She had learned from the servants' talk and from old Dr. Bramwell and from a quiet study of her husband's own papers with his leave, exactly what Josiah Cain was, and exactly how he had ruined her father, and, this was the heart of it, exactly what had truly become of Cain's 2 dead young wives, whose fortunes he had taken, and whose deaths the county had wondered at, even as it blamed the wrong man for them. She had gathered it patiently, a witness here, a document there, a frightened maidservant's account taken down and sworn, and she laid it out now, before Cain and his lawyer and the assembled household, quietly and completely, the doubled debts exposed as Cain's own forgery, and behind them the far darker thing, the true history of the man who dealt in ruined gentlemen and their daughters. And she watched the oily smile die on Josiah Cain's face as he understood that the terrified coin of a girl he had meant to collect had become, in the black house above the sea, something he had never reckoned on. A woman who knew everything and could prove it, and was not afraid of him at all. It had cost her more than anyone in that hall could guess, the gathering of it. In the weeks since she had overheard the truth of her husband, Verity had not been idle a single day. She had won the confidence of the servants who had guarded their master's secrets so fiercely, not by prying but by proving herself worthy of them, by taking her place at Ravenscar as its true mistress, by her kindness to the frightened kitchen girls, and her care of the old and the sick among the tenants, until the household that had watched her at first with wary silence came to love her and to talk to her, and to tell her at last the things they had told no outsider in 10 years. She had sat with old Dr. Bramwell and drawn from him, gently, the whole history of the fire and the dead brother and the poor first duchess. And she had done more, hearing a whisper here of Cain's dealings and a rumor there of his first wife's strange death. She had followed the threads with a patience and a nerve that would have done credit to any magistrate, writing letters, seeking out a dismissed servant of Cain's who had seen too much and been paid to forget it, riding herself to take down a frightened woman's sworn account before a clergyman. She had made herself, quietly, in a few short weeks, the one person in the county who held the whole truth of Josiah Cain in her hands. And she had done it all without a word to her husband, for she had wanted to lay it before him, finished, a shield and a sword and a gift, rather than burden him with one more danger to fret over and try, in his stubborn, self-sacrificing way, to face alone. It came apart for Josiah Cain very quickly after that, as such things do. Once the truth is spoken aloud by someone the powerful have been careless enough to overlook. The forged debts laid bare were fraud, and fraud that could hang a man. And behind them, Verity's patient, dreadful, well-witnessed account of the fate of Cain's 2 wives was enough. Once it was in the hands of the magistrates, and no longer whispered but sworn, to turn the whole current of the county's suspicion at last in its rightful direction. Cain blustered and threatened, and found his threats gone hollow. and within the month it was not the Duke of Ravenscar, but Josiah Kane, who fled the county one step ahead of the law, his name and his fortune in ruins, never to trouble Verity, nor her father, nor any other desperate man's daughter again. And a strange thing happened at Ravenscar in the wake of it, slowly, over the seasons that followed. The truth, once it had begun to be spoken, went on being spoken, and the county that had feared the monster of Ravenscar for years began, grudgingly and then warmly, to learn what it had slandered: the burning barn, the tenants saved, the grieving man who had borne every rumor rather than trade on his own goodness, until the black house above the sea, which had stood shuttered and dreaded for a decade, opened its doors again, and there was light in its windows and laughter in its cold galleries, for the first time in longer than anyone could remember. But that was all still to come. On the night the danger broke, when Kane had gone and the household had gone to its rest, and the great house stood quiet at last, the Duke of Ravenscar came to find his wife, not stiffly, not at a formal distance, but as a man comes to the one person in the world he cannot do without. He found her in the firelit study where she had once stood weeping in the cold outside the door, and he stopped before her, and there was no mask left on him at all, only the scarred and weary and wondering face of a man who had been alone so long he scarcely knew how to stop. "You defended me," he said, low, "before them all, you who were sold to me, who owed me nothing, who had every reason to let me be ruined and go free of the monster you were given to. Instead, you stood in my hall and fought for my name with your own 2 hands. Verity, no one has defended me in 10 years. I had forgotten it was a thing that could happen." He reached up, hesitant, half afraid still, and touched her face, as though she might yet vanish. "I bought your father's debts to save you from a monster, and you have spent every day since saving me from being one, not because I ever was, but because I had begun, in all these years of being feared, to more than half believe the county's verdict on myself. You have given me back my own name. I do not know how a man thanks his wife for that. I do not know how a man deserves it." "You do not thank me," said Verity, and she was smiling and weeping a little, and she covered his scarred hand with her own, where it lay against her cheek. "You simply stop keeping me at the far end of the table. That is the whole of the reckoning, Lucian. I was sold to the Duke the whole county feared. It is the best bargain anyone in my family ever made, though my poor foolish father will never understand why. He thought he was buying my safety at the price of my happiness, and selling me to a monster to save me from a worse one. And instead he sold me, by the strangest grace, to the one man in England who would spend his whole fortune to protect me, and never ask a thing in return. And I have spent these weeks discovering that the frightening bargain was the kindest thing that ever happened to me. Now take me home, not to the beautiful cold rooms, home, to you." And the Duke of Ravenscar, who had shut every door of himself and his house for 10 long years against a world that had wronged him, took his wife's hand and led her through the black, silent halls that were black and silent no longer. And the tale draws its curtain there, as such tales must, and leaves them their hard-won privacy, save for one small thing that the old housekeeper, Mrs. Pole, observed, and told of, misty-eyed, ever after. That night, and every night thereafter, the master of Ravenscar left the door of their chamber standing open behind them onto the warm-lit gallery, he who had lived behind locked doors for a decade, as if to say to the whole watching house and the whole watching world that he had nothing left to hide and no one left to fear, and that the girl who had been sold to him for a stack of paper had, by the strange grace of an overheard secret, unlocked the last shut door in the loneliest house in England, and would keep it open now for good. If this story kept you company tonight the way a candle keeps company with the dark, then stay a moment longer with me. Tap that like, so more good souls find their way to this quiet corner where the wronged are cleared at last, and the ones the world calls monsters prove the truest hearts of all. And subscribe and stay close, for there is another great house, and another closed door, and another secret waiting just behind it, for the next time we sit together. Until then, my dear, be slow to believe what the whole county agrees upon. The monster is so often only a good man, no one ever troubled to hear.